Well, good morning. I have been thinking and praying a lot this week about today, and the thought that sort of came to my mind was, what what do you do when you feel all alone? Um, there's one day this week when I had sort of set aside time to be reading and praying and get started on this. And I realized at the end of the day that the only person I had talked to that day was the sweet young girl in the drive-through line. Where you pull up and they say, can I get a name for the order? And I was like, oh, I have a mobile order for Valerie. And she's like, oh, Valerie H? Okay, have a great day. And that was it. That was the only conversation that I had had that day. And, there's nothing wrong with having a day to yourself and even being alone, but that feeling of loneliness or feeling of being all alone when you have a big thing coming up or when you have to make a decision and maybe it's related to your work and you're the only one who does your job in your way and the only one who can really know this. And I think we have these moments maybe where we can feel alone, and what do we do with that? Okay, so over the past few weeks in this series, we've heard about Dorcas, or Tabitha, and we read about how her very small acts had made a huge impact in her community. We read about a girl who didn't have a wasn't named in the Bible, Naaman's wife's servant girl, and how her one sentence changed Naaman's life for the better. And then we last week heard about Rahab's willingness to trust the spies and to act out of this faithfulness, and it rescued her family from destruction and wrote her into the history of the Messiah. And if you missed any one of those, I really encourage you to go back and listen to them. They're on our website and they're on our YouTube channel. So the big idea for this series is that everyday people with faithful obedience can make an eternal impact. And I'm thinking that we can start to see ourselves in these stories of these everyday people and recognize that when we live out of this faithful obedience, we can see the eternal impact. Okay, so we're wrapping up Quiet Strength today with the book of Esther. And I would like to point out that it is more than a few sentences. It's an entire book. So I will not get anywhere near to doing full justice for the story. But ladies, good news. We have a Bible study on the book of Esther starting next week. So you can join in for that, which I'm really excited about. Maybe you've heard or read this story a bunch of times. Maybe you've barely know it. Maybe you just know the Hollywood version of it. But we're going to be reading through some different passages. So if you have a Bible and you want to open to Esther, you can. Some context, because I have to have some of the history here. This story would have taken place sometime in the 4th century BC, 400 to 500 years before Jesus came. The Israelites at one time had been a great nation. They had great leaders like David. They had this covenant with God that God had given them a set of laws, and they sort of followed them. But then they started allowing other gods into their worship. They had leaders who weren't great and weren't following God's laws. And because of that, they were conquered by other nations. And they lived in exile out of the promised land for many years. And that's the time in history that this story takes place. Most of the Israelites are living in a foreign land. They are foreigners. They are under the rule of a different government. They're a conquered people group. And I think that's important for us to understand Esther's life. So their current government over them is the Persian Empire. I have a picture. Ruled by King Xerxes. This is a picture of all the different empires in the world at the time, approximately. And if you zoom in, you can see that yellow section is the Persian Empire. So it stretched from India to Egypt. It was the largest empire of its time period. And so here's our setting, and we get an introduction to this empire and to this ruler in chapter 1 of Esther. So I'm going to read verses 2 through 5. At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa, and in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. The military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes and the nobles of the provinces were present. Verse 4. For a full 180 days, he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and splendor and glory of his majesty. When these days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days in the enclosed garden of the king's palace for all the people from the least to the greatest who were in the citadel of Susa. And after that, it continues with descriptions of how extravagant this party was. It lists the linens and the draperies and the food and the drink and how liberally everything was given to the people. Very extravagant. My mom's going to make fun of me because I'm going to point out the numbers because I have to, because they're just so interesting to me. 180 days. Do you know, our school year is 180 days, right? Ask any school teacher. It's a long time, right? Or students. It's a lot of days. That's a long time to just be having a party, right? And this was a major flex, I think, on his part. That's the term that the young kids use. He was really showing himself off. He was really glorifying himself and his empire. Very, very extravagant. So I want you to recognize that. And at the end of all of this, he summons his wife. And if you know this story, you know this part, Queen Vashti, because he wants to show her off too, just like he's showing off everything else. And this was a direct command of the king. And the scripture says that he was in high spirits. And I think that word spirits, has another meaning as well, the kind of spirits that he was high in. And he sent out this command, but this command was degrading, inappropriate, but it was a command of the king. And Queen Vashti refuses it. She refuses this direct command with the entire city of Susa present and watching. And in verse 12, it says that Xerxes became furious and burned with anger. And that is the catalyst for the rest of the story. So this is the situation that's going on. All right, I'm going to skip down to verse 13 in chapter 1. It says, since it was customary of the king to consult experts in matters of law and justice, he spoke with the wise men who understood the times and were closest to the king. So her refusal to follow this command was a big deal. Such a big deal that he felt the need to seek out what he considered wise counsel, his experts of law and justice, and ask for their counsel. And I put wise counsel in quotes. So this is their response and then their reasoning behind their response. And I think it is important. Skipping to verse 16. Then Memucan replied, Queen Vashti has done wrong not only against the king, but also against all the nobles. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day, the Persian and Median women of the nobility who've heard about the queen's conduct will respond to the king's nobles in the same way. Verse 19. Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes, and let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. Then when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands, from the least to the greatest. So he sought this wise counsel, and they said, you can't let the queen do that because then all of our wives will be out of control too. So you better act fast and you better act harshly. And so that's what the king did. And their wisdom and their advice was rooted in their own pride and desires, and their desire to lift themselves up and push others down. And that's important in showing us who this kind of king was and what kind of empire that he was ruling. He was not godly by any means. He was prideful, extravagant, self-indulgent. The standard of law in his empire was whatever he wanted it to be. The Israelites had been given a code of law, a standard, by their God who had rescued them from Egypt and led them to the promised land. And they didn't stick with it, but they did recognize that you could have a standard that wasn't set by wishy-washy human rulers. There's a better word than wishy-washy. I just can't. Unpredictable. That's the better word. Okay, now chapter 2 introduces us to a new character, which is Esther, the name of the book. It continues in showing the king's extravagance, but this time it's with the young women in the region. Not the region, across every province. So from Egypt to India, they round up all of the beautiful young women in order to choose a new queen. And this is where we are introduced to Esther in verse 7 of chapter 2. It says, Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her mother and father died. So based on this description, we're not going to be surprised that she is also rounded up with all of the young women who are beautiful to go before the king. And I feel like Hollywood has done a really good job of romanticizing this story. When I was in college, there was a movie that came out called One Night with the King, and it was so romantic. No, that's not what this was like. This was like a life sentence for all of these women. If they weren't chosen by the king, they were part of his harem forever. That was it for them. It was life-changing for them. They didn't get to go back to their regular lives or to their family or anything like that, because that's the kind of ruler that he is. Esther was a nobody. She was a foreigner with a foreign name. She was orphaned, being raised by her cousin. And so I would imagine that for most of those reasons, that society probably would have looked down on her. And I think it's important to point out that none of those things were any fault of her own or because of any choice that she had made. She was just an ordinary person, which is what we're talking about this month. And she will have faithful obedience, and she does create an eternal impact. So, the book of Esther is full of coincidences, and this is one of the coincidences where the king chooses Esther to be his new queen. And if you really study it, you know that they're not actually coincidences, that they're divinely inspired. Now, we're going to move to chapter 3, and we're going to be introduced to one more new character. Chapter 3 introduces the bad guy. Every good story has to have a bad guy. This guy's name is Haman. Haman had been elevated to second in command, right below Xerxes, in the kingdom, and everybody was supposed to bow down to Haman. But Mordecai, so Esther's cousin, Mordecai, refused to do so. He would not bow down to Haman, and Haman was furious about it, right? You've got a whole city of people bowing down and one guy standing up. That is not good enough for Haman. And then Haman found out that Mordecai was a Jew, and so he set out to destroy Mordecai, but also all of Mordecai's people. That's in verse 6 of chapter 3. Okay, so Haman takes this proposal to the king. And I'm going to read verses 8 and 9. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them." Verse 9, "If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury." Now, before I get to the lovely number, I noticed that the word separate, these people keep themselves separate and their customs are different. Those words are synonyms for the word holy. So these people were trying to still live in a way that would have honored God, even though they weren't in their homeland. They weren't under the leadership of one of their people. They were still trying to be different and separate and set apart for God. And so I think that is admirable. And it also feeds into Haman's just hatred. So Haman requests that the king issues a decree to destroy all of these people. That's how deep his hatred really is. He wants them completely wiped off, all the Jewish people. And in return, he's promising 10,000 talents of silver. Does anybody know how much that is? I was fascinated to figure this out, right? I need to know how much 10,000 talents of silver is. And spoiler alert, it is a lot of money. I looked up how many people in the world today have at least that much money, and there's only 7,000 people on earth today that have more than 10,000 talents of silver. It is an estimated $400 million. That's so much money. We have we throw around millionaires and billionaires a lot in our society. There are not that many people that have that much money. That is a lot of money. So was that much money really that big of a deal to such a huge empire? Yes, it was. The estimates say that the entire national income of Persia at that time would have been 15,000 talents of silver. So this would have increased their national income by 2/3. So it was a lot of money that Haman was offering to the king. And how could Haman afford this? He couldn't. He was suggesting that this would be taken by plunder from all of the Jews as they were being destroyed. All of this because one man wouldn't bow down to him. Talk about pride. Pride is something that seeps down into our souls, and it changes the way we think, and it directs all of our thoughts to push others down and to lift ourselves up above them. And Haman was appealing to the king's own pride and self-indulgence in this proposal. Why wouldn't the king agree to this, right? We already know he was extravagant. He probably needs that $400 million to throw another 180-day party. We've already seen the king's advisors prop up his own pride. So, of course, he allows Haman to write this edict, and it's sent out to every province. And then at the end of chapter 3, we see them toasting each other to a job well done that day. It also says at the end of chapter 3 in verse 15 that everyone who heard this new law was bewildered. And I think that's kind of an indicator that the Jews were trying to live as the people that God called them to be in this place and in this time. So much so that people were amazed that there was somebody who would want to wipe them out. So they weren't like, the scourge of society, let's get them out of here. That wasn't common, at least in this context. All right, chapter 4 tells us that the Jews were overcome with fear and grief and mourning and fasting and weeping and wailing. It was a devastating blow to them. And it's at this point in the story that we're reminded of Esther. Remember her? She has been up in her literal high castle, alone, cut off from her people. It kind of seems like she doesn't even know that this is happening until she tries to talk to Mordecai, but she can't. She has to have a go-between, a servant kind of go between them. So she went from being a nobody to being the queen, and yet she's alone and sort of helpless, disconnected. And I picture her feeling very, very alone in this time. So Mordecai sends her a message with a copy of the edict, and he instructs her, go to the king and get this edict reversed. Have him have mercy for our people. But the problem is, you can't just show up in the king's court without being invited. And it's not just poor etiquette. It's punishable by death. So what Mordecai is asking her to do is to put her life on the line for people. So what does Esther do when she feels all alone? She leans into her community in a couple ways. So quiet strength relies on intercession. Esther seeks out Mordecai's counsel. She finds that way to remain connected to her people, even though she is physically separated from them. And she asks for their help. She asks for intercession. I'm going to read Esther 4, verses 15 and 16. It says, Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. There is strength in this kind of community, one that's willing to intercede for each other, pray for each other, fast together. That's one of the things I really love about our Saturday morning prayer time, is because we may have, a time where it's silent and you're kind of just praying on your own, but so is everyone else, praying to the same God and praising the same God. And then we have a time where we do pray together, and that's where we're interceding for the people that we love, the things going on in our community, and there's something really special about that sort of intercession. So Esther asks her people to intercede for her by fasting and praying, and then all the while she is getting ready to go intercede for them. She's going into the throne room of the king to intercede on behalf of her people. And remember, her intercession comes at the risk of her life. But we're given that same charge to intercede for each other, but it's an invitation into the throne room without threat of our lives. Hebrews 4:16 tells us that we can approach God's throne with grace and confidence, throne of grace with confidence. And that when we do that, we find mercy and grace in our time of need. And then James 5:16 tells us, instructs us to pray for each other, and that we find healing when we do so. So quiet strength, the kind of that everyday people out of faithful obedience create an internal impact, that relies on intercession. Are you interceding for your people? Are you asking them to intercede for you? The next thing that I noticed about Esther is that quiet strength responds with humility. There is a major contrast between King Xerxes and his reliance on his wise men and close advisors who are filled with their own pride and giving advice out of their fear, and Esther's humble consultation with her cousin who's looking out for all of their people, not just himself and not just herself. Seeking wise counsel is so important when we're making big decisions, when we feel alone in those decisions, but you have to be able to identify what is the wise counsel. That the test for that, I think, is humility. Both Xerxes and Haman were driven by their anger and their greed and their pride. Picture a little dollar sign, canvas bags full of silver coins. A desire to see other people pushed down. A desire even to the point of annihilation. But Esther acts out of love and courage and humility, and she's willing to risk her life for her people. And we are charged for this in this humility as well. Philippians 2, verses 3 and 4 says, "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of others." And then verses 5 through 11 show us how Jesus himself lived out that humility and calls us to live it out in the same way. Quiet strength responds with humility. And lastly, quiet strength requires community. So Esther had the weight of all this resting on her, and she turns to her community. And Jesus tells his followers that the thing that will separate them from everybody else, the thing that will be the indicator that they are his people, is how they love each other, how we love each other. In the New Testament and the early church even calls this community by a very strong name, family. So many times, Paul calls Timothy his son. He calls Epaphroditus his brother. And Jesus himself, in Matthew 12, verse 50, he says, "Whoever does the will of my Father in heaven, that is my brother and my sister and my mother." He really ties this community to family, using that family language. There's a song that we used to sing every week at church, and I loved it. And I did not know that there were verses to it, but it says, "You will notice that we say brother and sister round here. It's because we're a family, and these are so near. When one has a heartache, we all share the tears and rejoice in each victory in this family so dear. From the door of an orphanage to the house of the king," doesn't that sound like Esther? "No longer an outcast, a new song I sing. From rags unto riches, from the weak to the strong, I'm not worthy to be here, but praise God, I belong." That's how I have always felt. I'm not worthy to be here, to be part of this community, but praise God that I get to be. And the chorus says, "I'm so glad I'm part of the family of God. I've been washed in the fountain, cleansed by his blood, joint heirs with Jesus." That's mind-blowing. As we travel this side from part of the family of God. And I think it's so important that we see each other and treat each other as family. I've been so blessed to grow up in this community and experienced it as my family. On that day when I realized that I was feeling alone because I hadn't spoken to anyone, I had people that I could reach out to because I grew up in this family community. But sometimes we need that reminder when we do feel like we're all alone, that we do have a family to reach out to. And we have to build that in small moments, in the little text messages, in the friendly conversations, in the, "Hey, can you pray for me?" Or, "Hey, I've been praying for you." Those moments, so that we have that bond when we really need it, when we really are feeling that way. To reach out to that family so dear. To reach out for intercession like Esther did. To reach out with humility to lift each other up. We need this. We need this. I want you to look at the person beside you and say, "Welcome to the family." Okay, now look at somebody you're not actually related to and say, "I need you and you need me." Okay. I truly believe that in a family like this, we can be those everyday people we can live in faithful obedience, and we will see an eternal impact. And so we're going to close with communion because that is a community act. And so I'm going to ask Jonathan to come up and lead us in that.
Thank you, Valerie. I love that story of Esther. I love her faithfulness in the midst of trial and just knowing that she had that community. I think it's so powerful to pray for her, to intercede for her as she was getting ready to intercede for them. And how many times have we found ourselves in that same situation where we're reaching out and saying, hey, I just need you to pray. You know, we've got this coming up this week, and not quite sure what's going to take place. And what a comfort it is when you know that people are praying for you. You know, it's a joy to not only be on the receiving end of that. I think it's a joy to be on the giving end of that when you can text and let someone know, lifting you up today, praying for you today. And it is a part of that family. And this morning as we come to this time of communion, you know, the Apostle Paul, in 1 Corinthians chapter 11, he writes this to the church. And I love the way in which he walks into this moment with them. He says, for I received from the Lord what I also passed on to you. The Lord Jesus, on the night he was betrayed, he took bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and said, this is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And in the same way, after supper, he took the cup, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this whenever you drink it in remembrance of me. For whenever you eat this bread and drink of this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Therefore, whoever eats the bread and drinks the cup of the Lord in an unworthy manner will be guilty of sinning against the body and blood of the Lord. A man ought to examine himself before he eats of the bread and drinks of the cup. For anyone who eats and drinks without recognizing the body of the Lord eats and drinks judgment on himself. And I think it's important for us in these moments that can become so routine, that become so familiar to us, that we recognize what it is that we're doing, and that we take the time to really examine our hearts and see where we are in relationship with God, and to trust that he loves us, that he's calling us, that he desires to have that relationship with us. And sometimes we can find ourselves distant because of our own disobedience. And so what a great opportunity, even in the moment, to bow ahead and say, Father, forgive me, for I've not been doing it the way in which you've called me to do it. I've been walking in my own strength, not in your spirit. And would you once again forgive me, restore me, and to be able to drink with just an excitement, to be able to eat with an excitement, proclaiming the Lord's death, his resurrection, his promise that he's coming again, and that we can do that with family here this morning. And so today we're going to open up this communion table. We're going to open up the altars, and if you would like to partake in communion, if you're a believer here this morning, we invite you to do that. If you're not comfortable with that this morning, it's okay. You can stand and sing and just give God praise, but just know that we are praying for you, that we're here for you, and that you're not alone. You know, that question of, do you feel alone? We've all felt that in our life, and maybe you felt that even this morning, and to realize today that you're not, that there are those that surround you, that love you, that are praying for you, and there's a God in heaven who died for you. And so this morning we open up the communion table. I invite you to stand with me today. We're going to make our way out from the middle row and just come take an element. You can open up the bread and then flip it up and open up the juice, and just do so reverently this morning as we sing praises to the Lord. Won't you come?